So I'm honored to be here. It's an honor to get to come and to talk about the work that we have taking place through GoLisa, the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Program. Our work very much strives to cross the boundary between the US and Canada and to build partnerships and to really share our lessons and our work around the subject of climate change and climate change adaptation throughout the Great Lakes region. So just a kind of a map here. I'm going to give you a brief overview of RISAs. These are the Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program of NOAA. I'm going to talk a bit about the relationship between RISAs and the other US federal agencies who are coming on the scene around climate change. And then the role of GoLisa in the Great Lakes region and some of the key elements of what our approach is, has been, and how it's evolving to bridge the relationship between the creation of climate data and then the dissemination of really useful and usable climate information to a variety of stakeholders. GoLisa itself is a joint initiative between the University of Michigan and Michigan State. It is housed at the Climate Center at the University of Michigan, and we're funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We strive to straddle the boundary between research and service, and we call ourselves a boundary organization, and that's a model that we also try to extend in our work through what we call the boundary chain model. GoLisa is one of 11 RISAs throughout the US. The RISAs exist throughout the continental US. We also have a RISA in Alaska and in the Pacific Islands. The RISA community is part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It lives within their Climate and Societal Interactions Climate Program Office. RISAs have been in existence since 1995. They're one of the oldest federal programs specifically aimed at climate research and information dissemination. What's become very interesting in the last several years, and it's an opportunity but also certainly a challenge for us, is starting to understand where RISAs fit as more and more of our US federal agencies are standing up climate adaptation programs. So President Obama has made great strides through a number of executive orders to make sure that climate adaptation and preparedness are being integrated into the work of not just NOAA, but also the US Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Interior, the White House itself. We, of course, just saw last year the publication of the most recent National Climate Assessment. And in all of these ways, we are looking for the way that we fit together at the federal level, which is something that I am thankfully not asked to think about too much. But I do have to think about it at the regional level. And we look across the region, we face a couple of challenges. One, the Great Lakes aren't one. The Great Lakes region, the 8 states and the 2 provinces that we see as our region aren't actually a jurisdiction to anyone else. So we see that the service area that we cover cut up between the Midwest and the Northeast, and all of these agencies have a very different way of cutting that. The EPA cuts it one way. Some of the federal agencies and just their sub-agencies cut up the regions in a different way. So we're currently in a competition to remain the Great Lakes RISA for the next 5 years. And in doing so, this was just a survey of who are the other federal agencies active in our region that we need to be thinking about. And to accommodate that, we actually need to have such an expansive view of it. We have partners that we need to look at all the way out to Colorado because their service area covers to Ohio. And so how do we need to really be strategic? And one of the great advantages that we have is being right there. We're right in the heart of the Great Lakes region. We sit in Michigan. No one can question. There's really the heart of the Great Lakes here, at least for the US. And we've become a bit of a convener. So we've been able to say, hey, we want to talk to the RISAs who are here. So we have another actual Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program on the eastern border. They're dedicated to really urban affairs. We've called out to our climate science centers. These are also funded by NOAA. They're located, I believe, in Massachusetts and in Iowa. And we've said to them, we want to talk with you about how you're thinking about your research because we can help you share it out. We want to talk to the LCCs. These are landscape conservations. They cover the US and Canada also. They try to be transboundary and say, you know what, we're not experts in landscape and ecology, but maybe you can help us be. And how do we start to build these really effective engagements and try to make what all of us are doing more efficient, but also clear to the end user, so that when we have somebody who asks a question about what does climate change mean for me, if they show up at my door or they show up at the door of the Climate Center in Massachusetts, or hopefully if they show up at the door of Environment Canada, they can get a very similar answer and a very similar set of information so that those end users feel empowered to really ask questions and go out and find answers. A little bit of what we do, which we think is unique. We sit here trying to cross the full region between Canada and the US. And to do that, we employ what we call our boundary chain model. We work to balance local and historical information with future regional information. We take very seriously how do we integrate climate data into decision making. Where is the place for climate data when you're talking to your stakeholders? And then we also have a huge component, which is our research and our social science. So understanding the social learning and the network mapping. Is our approach effective? Are we building climate literacy? Is there uptake in climate in policy making? Are we being effective? And we have it's an honor, it's an opportunity to get to have funding that says, yes, study yourselves and tell us if you're effective, and then change and shift and be flexible. And that's part of the opportunity that we have as a RISA to make those adjustments as we need them. So our boundary chain model, this is the concept which is a kind of at the heart of how GoLisa operates. We can't be everything to everyone. We know that. There's such a diversity of stakeholders, and I know the conversation at our table has come back to that again and again today. Is it a single data need? Is there a single way of providing this information that will resonate for everyone? No. And we can't reach them all, but what we can do is we can take climate data and we can become translators of it, and we use a process by which we either engage folks who come to us most serendipitously, or much more effectively, we run a grant program where we provide $50,000 a year to 5 to 6 partners who say, we have a trusted body of stakeholders. We want to integrate climate into the work that we do with those stakeholders. And we fund them, and then we also have 3 climatologists who sit on our staff, and they become part of those project teams. And they work directly with our partners, and they say, okay, let's talk about what is the challenge you're facing, what's the kind of information that is going to be most useful for your stakeholders, and then we produce the climate, and so we take the climate data, we make it into this useful and usable information for the partners that we work with, and then they disseminate it. They disseminate it through their contacts, through their stakeholder groups, out into the community. They have the trust and they have the credibility. We bring that information to them. And then we hope that they share it with one another, and that then that boundary chain and the web expands. I think we've covered this quite a lot today. I know in our small group we have, but just to say again, when we are talking about those climate impacts, what does it mean? What are the changes that really resonate? The averages are very important. But when we talk about actually preparation and adaptation, we need to think about extremes, and we need to think about seasonality. It's one thing to say that there's more precipitation in general. It's a very different thing to say there's much more precipitation in the fall and in the spring and less in the summer. More water, less water when you need it, and more water when you don't. So often That's what we're seeing across our region. And that's a story that only gets told when it's told with seasonality. Now, of course, the extremes. When are you getting pushed out of your thresholds? When you're being pushed out of your coping range? And we find very frequently it doesn't take a lot to push a system out of its coping range. And so when we start saying, what is the change going to be? It doesn't need to be magnitudes of change before that stormwater system no longer works, or because when that freeze-thaw cycle suddenly becomes erratic for a commodity farmer and their crop is threatened. So we can really drill down into say, what's important to you? What are your values? How might those extremes start to push you out of your, out of the way that you maintain and cope? The way that we present this data, the way that we synthesize it, is relying very heavily as an entry point on historical data. So we have, across the US side, we have these climate divisions. There are 26 divisions in the Great Lakes Basin. And we take the historical data by looking from 1950 to 81 and 80 to 2010, and we tell the story of change. And when we tell it at the regional scale, we're also able to get a whole context. There's also somewhere for place-based climatologies. These also rely on historical. These are so valuable when you walk into a community where there's a lot of doubt. It's a way of saying to somebody, I have seen the change in your community, I've learned about your community, I'm going to tell you what the quantitative explanation is for the qualitative experience you've been having. Like in Thunder Bay, you're talking about going around and saying, there used to be an ice rink here, we used to go skating on December 15th, we used to have these anecdotal experiences. We can say, what, here's the data that goes behind that. And this is the change we've already seen. It makes it a lot easier to walk through that next step and say, where are we going? And this is a tool which we recently released. It's the Cities Impact and Adaptation tool. You can go online, you can search for your city, and it will show you the climate divisions that are currently experiencing the climate that you will experience in 40 to 70 years out. You can cut this by changing the population parameters. You can look at various demographic characteristics. And then you can also open up climate stations. So you can see any of the climate stations and their exact information in the divisions that are represented. And this is an active tool we created, so you can see we created kind of a false division for Canada. This is in the case if anybody has climate divisions for Canada, we'd be very interested in that. There seem to be historically, but they've disappeared around maybe 81. And so we recreated something akin to division so that the map could function with the same scientific integrity that we had for the US side. We've also created a tool. This is unfortunately only on the US side, but here we've taken information regarding the economy, infrastructure, and vulnerability, and cross-cut it with climate information. And so this tool allows a decision maker to look county by county and see this information about, all right, in this vulnerable populations, they can see who is the most vulnerable, and we've created an index based on health parameters and vulnerability to heat. And so this shows what is their vulnerability, what are the characteristics that are making this county appear vulnerable versus other counties, and then it shows what is the change in the temperature trend. We're not forcing them into, climate change is doing this, but we're saying, if this is the vulnerability and this is the trend, call us. call us if you want to know more. Another important part of our work is we talk about the future projections. So we want to really get at how do we apply projections, which for us is very much taking existing climate data, taking existing projections and interpreting them and ensuring that our partners know how to apply that information in their decision making. We also do call into question, let me see if I can get this to go. This is Prism data. This is historical precipitation data. And part of our argument here is this is showing that historical precipitation data at a 200-kilometer resolution. This is what that data looks like when it's at a 24-kilometer resolution. It's not a really dramatic change over, let's say, the state of Michigan. There's a dramatic change when you look at the Pacific Northwest. The demand and the need for very exact downscaled climate data for the Pacific Northwest is great. For us, we see that demand a little bit less. We don't have the same topographic diversity. We can see a lot of the same patterns which move all across the region. Our real challenge, of course, comes in with the lakes. And I'm really excited to learn more about that last model we were talking about earlier, bringing in wharf and flake. But we haven't seen a good downscale dynamic model that really accommodates the lakes. So in all of our work that we do, we go around afterwards and we analyze our knowledge networks. We want to see if we're achieving integration. So this network map represents, the dots represent events, the squares represent documents, and the small dots represent individuals. And this is where events and individuals are being connected to documents regarding or related to climate change. And through cutting our information in different ways and looking at our network at different scales, we can see who's working at a local level, at the state, at the federal, and start to see where the interactions are, which will enable us to see where are the really critical intervention points. Our process is to do all of this, to reflect and to revise and to repeat. Our physical science initiative is really driven by what our project needs are. Our social science is informed by the project outcomes. The next year, we do it all again. We do a call for proposals. We do an external review. Our projects tell us what do they need and what are their outcomes. And so we have this really great opportunity annually to, revise and repeat, revise and repeat. And then every 5 years, we defend ourselves back to NOAA and we say, this is what we've been doing, this is what we'd like to keep on doing, and we'll have a great opportunity next week. I'm actually going to meet for a week with our RISA managers, and hopefully they'll tell us what more they want to see from us. Very quickly, this is what it looks like, GoLisa's process. Our interpreters want, they say that they want data. What they want to say is what has happened, what will happen, what are the impacts. Ultimately, very few people want digital data. They want to see it at a couple levels. We say local, so that they know we know them and they know us. And then we say regional, because we need to tell it in that regional story. We make these narrative descriptions. They look like tools like these. We say, has your temperature, it has your precipitation, maybe it has your growing season, maybe it has your freeze-thaw cycle. Whatever is important for you, we can bring you that data. This is, again, we put it in the local changes in a regional context. What will happen? Many of them ask for downscale data, but we find very few really need it to address their problems. So we've not relied heavily on that. Model-based concerned, little value added at most locations. But what really is important is taking that future projections and combining it with the local experience. We've heard this again and again today. An experience here on Isle Royale. We work with the National Park Service on Isle Royale to analyze what's going to be climate change impact on the wolf moose population there. And what we really come down to, very, very simple, ice versus water in the winter matters. This is a combination. This is looking at future projections, but it's also knowing the local area, bringing in local expertise. With what you see at the two weather stations, what does that mean in practice and on the ground? And through really combining all the resources, local expertise, future projections, and then our own weather knowledge, we can kind of come up with a scenario plan for their management. What are the impacts? Again, we say our stakeholders want climate information to determine climate impacts, but it doesn't work that way. Really, we find that the impacts of vulnerabilities are already there. We just need to daylight them. If we can daylight them, then we can come behind it. We can say, okay, here's the information that you need to really inform decision making. produce it again for them in a, in a usable format. So climate information needs to be tailored to the local experience. The resources should be developed in collaboration with our partners, and the information needs to include the historical, the seasonal, and the extreme events. Thank you.